generally tend to put more of my emphasis as a teacher, as an educator in it. So I'll go into a little bit of background about myself, and then I'll get into tonight's presentation. My focus in permaculture has really been heavily in education. And I've taught in New York City for 14 years, a freelance class that I ran out of first the 6th Street Community Center in Manhattan on the Lower East Side. For about 4 years, we were there. And then in Brooklyn at a graduates building on Atlantic Avenue called the Brooklyn Commons. And I mention that because very few permaculture teachers teach in a truly urban environment and teach about how to apply permaculture at an infrastructure level, at a regional level, to address, basically my focus has been for a long time how to address industrial contamination more than, let's say, the fact that we live on a planet where many civilizations have collapsed because of severe droughts that last for 30 years. This civilization wouldn't weather, not to pun, a 30-year drought very well, right? One of my latest reads right now, and one of my interviews that's coming up on my podcast, is with Brian Fagan, who's an archaeologist from University of, he works at University of California in Santa Barbara. He graduated from Cambridge, written a bunch of incredible prescient books all the way back 2004. He wrote a book about the long summer, how climate change changed history. I've been reading about this stuff and studying this for going on the order of since really about 1992, when I started teaching at a free school in Pennsylvania, and started really wanting to address the cancer epidemic and the industrial legacy of how polluted the Northeast is, polluted to the teeth. And big fan of reading books about Love Canal and Lois Marie Gibbs. So I get into some much more edgy issues than a lot of permies do, because a lot of permaculture is about guilds, gardens, herb spirals, chicken tractors, and creating your little ecotopic compound in the country, which certainly, your own little escape pod can be a good healing mode. But then you come back into reality and realize, well, a way has gone away, and the next nuclear power plant that has a meltdown is going to infringe on any hippie commune that gets built within hundreds of miles of it. So those are some quick anecdotals to say I really agree that we have pressing issues. We've had pressing issues, and permaculture as a technique, that part's easy. The real work, as Gary Snyder calls it, right? Snyder, a Zen beat poet who's also a friend of Jack, of Kerouac, and of Kenneth Rexroth, and of Allen Ginsberg. But Gary's probably the least known of all those individuals. More known out west. But Snyder's been writing poetry about Turtle Island and about what he calls the real work. What is the real work? And I would suggest the real work is what permaculture has been all about since it was brought about in the early 1970s, which is how do we address industrialization, right? To boil it down to nuggets, I think is useful. What is the main disease, the main illness, the main instability, to put it politely, that permaculture is focused on? Industrialization. It's a nightmare. And anybody who doesn't want to acknowledge that isn't going to really vibe with permaculture, right? Because permaculture is unapologetically critical of the industrial economy. It's a disaster, right? As Rebecca Solnit calls it, disaster economics, right? That's exactly, and to try to, like, at the end of the pipe, mitigate the scenario, please, we need an entirely new system. This whole adjusting furniture on the deck of the Titanic nonsense is a lot of what's happening with well-intended initiatives that are industrial in their mindset. What's happening with renewables? It's industrial scale. It's not regional scale. It's not decentralized. It's not distributed. Right? Decentralized and distributed energy solutions aren't what we're seeing implemented as a response to much of the concern about climate issues. Well-intentioned, but not well-planned, what's happening with the rollout of solar. So as an educator, my focus in what I'll be sharing with you tonight and what I teach in my permaculture classes, it's about addressing the entire legacy of colonialism, industrialism, and where that's ended us up, right? Which is in quite a soup to try to make sense of the world from the midst of a highly polluted, highly overextended, highly fragmented landscape and society, right? When you live in a damaged, diseased, and broken landscape, it's easy to think that that's normal, right? And this is what people like David Orr, who developed ecological literacy, who's an educator at Oberlin College, one of the important thinkers who influenced me back in the 90s to create curriculum around this stuff. Way before Jared Diamond was writing books like Collapse, and people were starting to begin to scratch the surface of the patterns that permaculture has been focused on since the early 70s, when Bill Mollison and David Holmgren really cooked it up. So myself, I was, in the early 90s, I graduated from college and I was traveling out to do revegetation of native species. I did revegetation of native species first for the Forest Service and subalpine meadows in the Mount Baker Snoqualmie Wilderness Area, which is 11.3 million acres, the largest wilderness area in North America. And there I learned a lot about plant propagation, remote site access. We would hike with trail crew for 10 miles into wilderness areas and do erosion control and check dams in drainage gullies that were created from social trails where people just run straight up a mountain. So I learned a lot about how to live in very minimal environments. In 10th grade, I had the good fortune of living with gypsies for 2.5 months in Greece with a class that was called Grassroots Expeditions, where the leaders of that program were friends with Romani and took us to live in horse-drawn carts for 2.5 months in the southern Peloponnese of Greece, where we cooked all our food for 13 people over campfires for 2.5 months, sleeping outside. And experiences like that are part of why I feel I can teach permaculture from a more down-to-earth perspective. And because of teaching in New York City for the last 14 years and thinking about the Northeastern Corridor and thinking about the industrial economy and how to disentangle our association with that web of deceit. I also lived off the grid for 8 years and built my own house, straw bale, natural building, gravity-fed water, working for Patch Adams and Gesundheit in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. Lived there for 8 years doing that, specifically to learn what my teachers had taught me in 1996 at the farm in Tennessee, who are Peter Bain and Chuck Marsh and Patricia Alice, and they're folks who built Earth Haven, which is an eco-village outside of Asheville, North Carolina. And they had to leave their own eco-village because of how poorly the meetings were run and how much it burned them out energetically. So Peter now lives in Bloomington, Indiana with his partner, Keith Johnson, and they still run Permaculture Design magazine, which is the only magazine on permaculture in North America. And it's my teachers who, the reason I went and studied with them was because I read that magazine and I wanted to study with teachers who had been practicing permaculture design in a landscape that I was pretty sure I wanted to create a training center in, which is the Northeast temperate ecology. And they know a lot about that landscape. Peter, Chuck, Patricia, Andrew Goodhart Brown. So I took that stuff back to my high school and incorporated it into my curriculum. and started going to the other discipline I incorporate is, I've read quite a bit, and I'm quite well read in Steiner and biodynamics, and can make sense of Steinerian language, which is unique to it, and studied here at Kimberton Hills, Camp Hill Village, and have studied biodynamics and incorporate that into how I work with really gardening and farming. So living off the grid, building a straw bale house, that for me was about creating the Center for Bioregional Living, which is still the name of my website, my educational services, because bioregionalism has been a framework that I felt as an educator I could continue to grow into conceptually, right? And it's this idea, bioregionalism is the idea that we create regions that are more self-reliant, not rugged individualists trying to be 100% self-reliant, but just more self-reliant. Because at present, we're really not. So how to address that? This hyper-extended long-distance transportation, globalized import-export economy that brings dinner to our table at night, and instead shorten the distance of the transmission of all essential goods and services. That's a design principle that I've languaged to articulate how can I bring down to an axiomatic phrase a design approach that addresses the foundational flaws of empires and civilizations that have collapsed before us, right? Because a main pattern of civilization collapse is how long your transportation supply lines are. And of course, in the fossil fuel age, when we want to address climate, when we want to address carbon footprints, suddenly transportation is an elephant in the middle of the room that's not being well addressed. We're expecting single occupancy vehicle innovations to have a substantial impact on transportation. It's not really a well thought out strategy, because transportation has a lot more to do with what are you transporting and why do you need to transport it and where are you transporting it to. And by redesigning the supply lines, you affect transportation at a much more foundational level than by simply looking at the actual means by which those modes are being powered, right? So thinking systemically about both addressing the historical pattern of civilization collapse has been something that I've been focused on for more than 20 years, and thinking about urban retrofit and redesigning the Northeastern Corridor for the last 10 years, and really focusing in particular on New York City. And New York City as a case study, because after living off the grid in Pocahontas County in West Virginia, I moved to Brooklyn and started doing analysis and assessment of the 5 boroughs and thinking about how do we redesign New York City with permaculture design? Because to me as a teacher, that gives me something that's worth students listening to me teach about. Am I just teaching them about how to run away from New York City and build some like straw bale house in Maine? Maybe, if you want to learn that, but that's not the only thing that I want to be able to teach about, right? So some of what we'll get into tonight will be these examples that, I want to give you a little sense of my trajectory, and just to share with you in this startup point here, that a big focus of my work has been education and how to bring these ideas to a population that may not be interested in farming, gardening, or homesteading, but maybe instead artists, creatives, entrepreneurs, people who want to now know what they can do next in their career, right? We have purposefully positioned our program to attract people who are career transitioning. And so that's enough, I think, about my background. Any questions? All right, cool. Let me get in. Yeah.
I don't want to divert too much time. Can you make a quick reference for me for the comment about previous empires linked to the distance for transportation of their food supplies?
Oh, what examples of that?
Or a resource I can look at to glean them?
Well, some of that is in this latest Brian Fagan book that I was recommending, Climate Chaos. He
Okay,
gets a lot into that particular analysis. I'd
Okay.
also say overall, that's a pattern that goes back to Toynbee, who wrote a book called Mankind and Mother Earth, to give a sense of how dated it is.
Mm.
And Toynbee, many historians have been saying this about the Roman Empire, about the British Empire, about in general, what are one of the in patterns in history that repeat themselves. And one of them that is a recurring theme is this longer transportation infrastructure creates all kinds of vulnerabilities.
Okay, thanks. I'm really interested in that. I mean, I've
Yeah.
reached the same conclusion on my own, just examining what's going on and what seems like
Yeah.
obvious solutions. But
Yeah.
it's interesting to keep the big perspective. So thank you.
And I'll be elaborating on that in what I'm presenting, because what I'll build up to and synthesize with is this idea of what does a regional infrastructure look like? What does it look like to begin to apply what I'm right now just kind of orating about? I'm going to show you images and maps and examples and break it down. What does this look like to actually retrofit the industrial infrastructure with permaculture design at a regional scale? Because the other thing that I find compelling about this, I think you'll find it interesting as a way to, as an entry point to think about permaculture that isn't usually the way it's approached or applied, but it's also much more inclusive of a broader cross-section of our society, right? Because one of the mistakes and weaknesses of permaculture is relying on this notion that it's going to be accomplished when everybody decides they want to have their own garden. Is it? Or could it be that we need to present an idea that addresses the entire system so well that there's tons of ways for people from all kinds of different skill sets to engage in a solution set that is actually a truly comprehensive solution to the problems that we're facing? That's what makes permaculture compelling. It's not because it gives you good books about how to plant some fruit trees with some berries and graze some rabbits under it. Great. It also gives us ideas about retrofitting the entire industrial energy system, waste system, water system, building system, and energy. So let's look at those. Right? That's what we're going to look at. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the gardening stuff too, because it's also about gardening. Because when we think about civilization, right, let's first think about the fact that civilization depends upon, most importantly, a good food system. And this society has anything but that, right? So design is about designing for the whole system. Can folks see this? Yeah, cool. So I always start with this perspective because we want to think about the broad view as far as where are the principles of permaculture? Why is permaculture worth your time to be thinking about and approaching? And it's because it is an operating manual for Spaceship Earth. It gives us practical, applicable, broad scale ways of living that improve the reliability and the comfort of what the planet is providing for us. And it's tuned in to Gaia theory, biosphere, and the overall understanding of the planetary self-regulating mechanisms. It's important to understand that it's an incredibly dynamic planet. And what permaculture has always been about is how to have a wise ride on a dynamic and unpredictable planet where all kinds of things happen that are extreme. Meteorites, electrosolar flare, pulse rays, neutrinos going through all life right now. You know, sunlight from the center of the sun doesn't reach the outer surface of the sun until 200,000 years have passed because of how massive the sun is. right? So part of permaculture is about this broader planetary perspective and about dialing it in and saying, look, the Earth is an island, right? It's 24,901 miles in circumference. It's 70% ocean. It's 30% land. And here's where the design clues come in for where does permaculture emerge from, right? It emerges from the recognition that the ocean is the ultimate teacher and what are the conditions within which life will prosper. Why would I say that? Well, the evidence is in geologically that that's where life decided to hang out and have a great party for the longest extent of time. And that's a very long time, 4 billion years, right? So on a planet that's 4.5 billion years old, no life even bothers to get out of the beautiful amniotic fluids where you can just absorb your nutrients osmotically through your skin and you don't even have to chew. And gravity doesn't cause you to have to exert any calories because it has no effect on your body, right? A lot of reasons why life stays in the ocean. And we want to understand those reasons because those reasons are what we're going to replicate on the land with permaculture design. Because what we do with design is we manipulate site conditions to improve the capacity for that site, to provide you with more opportunities to garden, more opportunities to achieve the types of experience that you're trying to achieve on that site. How do you manipulate site conditions with earthworks, with buildings, with infrastructure, with the placement of elements in the landscape? That's what permaculture design is. Manipulating site conditions with the placement of the elements in the site in such a way that increases the beauty and the experience that you as the designer are trying to increase on that site. That site could be a backyard. That site could be a city block. That site could be Los Angeles, right? So the planet, we start with geology in permaculture. Let's remember, first, the ocean tells us temperature isn't something that life likes vacillation of. That's why it stays there for 4 billion years. Because water has more mass than air. And that's why on a planet in outer space, rocketing around a massive thermonuclear furnace, and every 12 hours being exposed to the freezing cold of outer space, the place you want to be is in a blanket, not on the land. So life stays under that blanket. What is a blanket that we can bring onto the land? Trees, right? Trees are something that could be 60 to 200 feet tall, intercept solar income, and are made up of 60 to 70% water, right? Trees are the way we bring the ocean onto the land. And they are one of the key tools, power tools of permaculture, are trees and animals, because we're borrowing from some of the most robust biological forces in the terrestrial environment, right? And we're understanding that the planet is constantly in flux. You know, horses were one time native to North America, then they went extinct, and then they were reintroduced to North America by the Spaniards. We're not attached to particular species in particular places. This whole recent focus on that is just a voyeuristic privileged class concept of things that matter in the world. Not to anybody who has to feed themselves are we hearing pamphlets handed out about how some species needs to be eradicated. It's only in privileged class societies that have vast amounts of fossil fuels at their fingertips that we hear nonsense like that. Those plants, those animals are ecological resources. That's why they're here. So the Earth, where are we on the planet? That's what defines what makes good design, as well as water. Water is the bottom line, right? How much of the water on the Earth's surface is actually potable and you can drink it and makes up 60% of your body, and you should be drinking 3 quarts a day? Only 3% of all the water on the planet's surface. And only 1% of that 3% is actually in circulation, because 2% of the 3% is locked up in polar ice caps or inaccessibly deep in groundwater reservoirs that we still can't drill, baby drill that deep. So as we look at methods of adaptation that permaculture gets its inspiration from, the Inca terraces embody the permaculture principle, catch, hold, and store energy. Energy cycling is probably the most important and the one I'm going to focus on in tonight's presentation. There's 12 permaculture design principles, but the foundational one that all the other ones emerge from is energy cycling. Because energy cycling is the one that points us to a broad application that then permutates into all the other principles. And it's the one that goes back to understanding how the ocean does what it does, and how terraces work, and how trees work, and how living systems work. Because what they do, they cycle energy. And what permaculture does is it thoughtfully integrates the relationship of these biologically innate behaviors, right? Introducing organisms and structures into landscapes that have mutually beneficial relationships. Permaculture design is encouraging us to orchestrate ecologies, to create what are called recombinant ecologies. In permaculture, we're concerned with the loss of cultivated diversity, because the loss of cultivated diversity is setting us up for starvation and for severe global famines. Right? 4 crops provide 60% of the world's food, and that is a setup for famine. And instead, we have over 4,000 plants that have been domesticated throughout human history. In fact, the Irish potato famine, just reading about that in a great biology book by a guy named Rob Dunn entitled Never Out of Season. And in this, Rob Dunn, biologist from University of North Carolina, he's saying this whole thing of never out of season, huge problem. It's created this globalized nonsense of a food system that is causing huge scale die-offs of plant species that then we can't recover from economically or food supply wise. And he goes in depth into studying the potato famine in Europe, right? 1 million, 1.5 million Irish people died in the potato famine. And he points out, he says, you know, we still don't really pay attention to how to prevent the potato famine from happening again. And he goes in depth into how many varieties of potatoes the Inca were growing, thousands of varieties, and how just 3 were being cultivated. In particular, this one called the lumper was the huge popular one in Ireland. And it mainly had to do with what the Spaniards brought back from the Inca and then cultivated on the Canary Islands and then took to Europe. And he said, of the varieties that were in the Inca Empire, the Spaniards just took a very small handful. Fortunately, today in Peru, there is extensive cultivation of a lot of these heirloom varieties. So they have discovered blight-resistant forms of potato that exist in the Inca Islands. And the terraces are a great example of how the Inca can take a landscape like what you see in the background of that image and actually transform it into something that can provide food for a high number of people, right? So they're taking like severe sloped, thin soiled landscapes, and with human time and labor, they're modifying the landscape to now make it so they can support a population base that's much larger than what you could support if you didn't build terraces throughout the Andean mountains, right? And terraces are a great example for you to key into early, that you understand what permaculture is talking about. What permaculture is on about is what we see when we look at terraces, right? Because when you look at terraces, you don't really have any sense of like, gee, I wonder if that's a good idea. And I ever like, you know, those look like somebody did a hack job on an excavator with a bolt. Who let those yahoos into the? No, they were all done with people power and hand tools. That's why they're so beautiful, right? I'm not saying you can't do beautiful work with excavators and bulldozers. You can. But what I am getting at is that human ingenuity and human capacity is something we vastly underestimate the potential of, right? For instance, recently when I was reading about and watching documentaries like I like to watch about places like Tiahuanaco. Tiahuanaco was the capital of the Aymara civilization in Bolivia near Lake Titicaca at 11,000 feet altiplano. This site, I love this site because this civilization existed because these folks knew how to throw a good party. And this civilization existed because they were really good at making chicha and having snuff boxes. And all of their giant stone edifices are of people holding chicha cans and snuff boxes. And it turns out that this civilization also threw huge parties where all the massive rocks that were moved there were hauled by people with ropes. And the archaeologists at first were like, this is impossible. Really? They moved all these massive multi-ton rocks just with people? And it turned out another local archaeologist wanted to reenact it. And sure enough, that's exactly how Tiahuanaco was built, all with people hauling ropes. So underestimating our capacity is an important thing not to do, because it can cause us to also think we depend more on a system than we actually do. So to get into the details of the term, right? Permaculture, it's a contraction. It's a contraction of a word that predates Mollison and Holmgren. And Mollison and Holmgren are purposefully using those words and creating the contraction because they're standing on the shoulders of the writings that use the term permanent agriculture. This is one of the seminal texts. It's called 40 Centuries of Farmers, written by a man named F.H. King, 1911. 1911, F.H. King goes to Japan, Korea, and China and studies how they're farming and says, these civilizations are ingenious at their recycling of night soil and human manure and of using water-based integrated canal systems with ducks, with fish ponds, and just the whole book. It's quite a fat book. It's a great book. It's still, to this day, a book that I look to find information about rice farming in Asia. Still one of the best books about it. Why do we care about rice farming? Well, because when we start to think globally about what gets the highest yields, polycultures always outproduce monocultures. And rice culture in general is 50 times its output for energy inputs. And if we looked at traditional people-powered agriculture, it's usually about 20 times its output of energy input. Whereas modern agriculture at best is 2 to 1. So for every unit of energy put into it, you get 2 units of food. When you grow food with people power and hand tools, for every calorie of energy a person's exerting, they're getting 20 calories of harvest. In rice agriculture, it's as high as 50 calories to 1 calorie of effort. So studies are in from the United Nations, from the Food and Agriculture Organization. As soon as we pull our heads out of the American tendency to not look around the rest of the world, we'll find that the FAO and the UN both agree with this statement that the most productive farms in the world are all maintained with people power and have no tractors in them, right? Let's think about watershed design. I focus a lot on this regional scale so that we can start to pitch permaculture ideas to entire communities as a retrofit approach for resilience and food security and a better plan as the planet continues to show us the challenges that it's going to continue to show us. And, when we look at this type of analysis is important because what permaculture is encouraging you to do is understand basic nation, state, and governmental structures, but then more importantly, or equally importantly, understand the geographic realities that underlay and overlay the political structures and the political and the economic structures and the socioeconomic structures. We need to create multiple layers and maps that we look at to start to create this data set where we can say, all right, what makes sense to do on a particular place? Or what I'm presenting is what makes sense to do at a watershed master planning scale. When we talk about what does a food system look like, a food system that goes beyond the model that the goal is to create a self-sufficient homestead. That model's easy. That focus is easy. What's more challenging is to say, what does it look like to retrofit the entire infrastructure? Not simply as a homesteader, go and become a rugged individualist who's able to grow all my potatoes. That's great. Totally go for it, but it's not gonna save the ship. So starting to think at this regional scale is what causes us to be able to adjust our tact at a more planetary and geographic application, rather than simply our own little backyard tinkering. That's one thing, but can we bring people on board to actually adapt the entire industrial food system to no longer be something that they continue to support, and actually support something that's more localized, that's ecologically restorative and feeds people and provides building materials and provides fuel crops, right? These are quotes from a UN study where they're saying, you know, the required transformation is much more profound than just tweaking the existing agricultural system. This is from a United Nations 2018 Strategies for Food Security document that they put out. And this is their way that they're saying, we really need an ecological intensification approach is basically what permaculture is. And what they're saying, the UN is saying, it's not about industrialization, it's about redesigning how we farm. So 90% of our food, this number you'll find corroborated in study after study, approximately 90% of our food does not come from anywhere close to where we live. It comes from thousands and thousands of miles away, 90% of what people eat.
Is that a US reference?
Yes.
American eaters, okay.
Yep. This is specific to the United States, yep. And I think furthermore, what's often not calculated in the true costs of the food system is groundwater contamination. So here we're looking at a map of the central United States where we've got widespread groundwater contamination with atrazine, which is a carcinogen and going to be very costly, if not impossible, to actually get out of groundwater, right? And then Superfund sites. Again, I find many people in the permaculture community aren't educated in these things, don't even ask questions about it largely, or would be reluctant to bring it into some of their programs because, you know, it might bring people down. I'm just like, hey, my job is not to give you a pep rally. My job is to actually teach you things that keep you from being bitten in the backside by knowing how to do research, right? Because it's really important that as Americans, we're skeptics of thinking that everything's okay just because we haven't heard about it, right? There's a lot we're not hearing about. And one of them is how many of the corporations who are alive and well and laughing all the way to the bank are responsible for some of the most egregious toxic legacies in the history of the world. I mean, and that's not an overstatement when you think about Westinghouse involved with the Savannah River site during the nuclear weapons manufacturing history of the United States. And you think about how widespread the radioactive contamination is on all the sites where we manufactured nuclear bombs in the United States, right? The Hanford site in Washington, that's on the Superfund list, you can be sure. The Unadilla Proving Ground in Oregon, that's where they want to build. This is one of my favorite ventures into the absurd that the federal government has gone into, well, in particular, Department of Defense. They want to build a chemical weapons incinerator at the Unadilla Proving Ground. And for some reason, I think that's complete insanity that anybody would even suggest that we would take chemical weapons that were created, let's just like stop for a minute and pause on that and be like, what? And then they want to build another chemical weapons incinerator at the Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland. And I can tell you the fun facts that my high school kids and middle school kids come up with when I ask them to research these. And the dinner table conversations that it starts with their families that I ask them to research these. That's the kind of thing too that gets people really upset. Why are you upsetting little, Susie and Jimmy with all this? Like, actually, they're all right talking about this in class. I think you're the one that's getting upset, folks. Right? A lot of people don't want to accept that DuPont, General Electric, and huge multinational corporations have left a totally egregious, unethical, toxic legacy that they are not being held accountable to clean up for. In fact, General Electric in the Hudson River Valley spent more on PR doctors creating the public impression that dredging the Hudson would exacerbate the PCB issue in the Hudson. They spent more money on propaganda to create the impression that that was of concern. Then they were actually forced to pay through the class action suit to the families and the communities that are along the banks of the Hudson. They spend 13 million. They had to spend 11 million on what the costs were of polychlorinated biphenyl. This is a bioaccumulative substance that never breaks down, right? How much can we charge a corporation for having just sent that from Schenectady when they built transformers all the way down the Hudson to New York City, right? What is the cost of that? So true cost, that's an important reality check to bring into conversations when people try to sort of rationalize, but how can we sacrifice jobs? Wait, no, what we're talking about is actually a sane economy rather than an insane, nihilistic, self-destructive economy. 37% of rivers and streams, unfishable and unswimmable. 50% of lakes and ponds, unfishable and unswimmable. That's according to the EPA, right? And of course, a lot of us know the Clean Water Act just got gutted again. I mean, it may as well because we haven't been enforcing it anyway, right? That's why, just like we don't enforce the Clean Air Act, So permaculture is about having an awareness of these things so that we begin to ask questions about, where do I live? What's near me? Maybe I live right next to a Superfund site, and this is why family members have been having chronic health problems. Maybe we went swimming in a waterway that was contaminated with either just bacteria, because really bacterial contamination is mild in comparison to industrial pollutants, right? And we've got both in this country in spades, right? It turns out that farming, if we ask the question, according to this analysis, where we start to ask more broad environmental questions about what matters, which is part of what I'm implying here is I'm outlining a way to say, here's why what I'm going to share with you matters, right? I know a lot of us think we already know that it matters, right? Well, we've got climate chaos, we've got all kinds of social inability. I understand that. But here's some more reasons about why this matters. Right? Another one is that the single largest non-point source of pollution in the United States is agriculture, right? So according to the EPA, the single largest non-point source of pollution, what that means is when rain lands on the Earth's surface and it just runs off carrying a contaminant, what's the single largest input of contaminants that is generated in this country when a rain event happens? Farming. Right? According to the EPA, farming is. So we need to adapt agriculture to actually be suited to topography, to water. It turns out this goes back to the 1930s. So here we are looking at a government document called 7,000 Years of Conquest that was put out 1938. Further use of the term permanent agriculture. Here, W.C. Loudermilk is telling us, he says, a terraced citrus orchard in southern France. It is believed that these terraces were built by the Phoenicians 2,500 years ago and are still maintained and providing good harvests, right? So these things are permaculture design methods applied throughout history. That's what terraces are. They're that same understanding of how do we intercept what's happening with water, with silt and sediments, how to create more cultivated areas. Here's another important seminal text, predates Mollison and Holmgren, 1924, J. Russell Smith, Tree Crops, subtitle, A Permanent Agriculture, right? This permanent agriculture thing, and what Mollison and Holmgren do is they contract it, right? Permaculture, it's a contraction of permanent agriculture. But it's more than what these cats were cooking up in the 20s and turn of the century, because what Bill and David add to it is building design, energy design, waste and water systems, food systems, also for annuals, right? A lot of the focus in the 20s and the turn of the century around the use of the term permanent agriculture was on trees and perennial crops, which is an important focus, right? And this is also a unique kind of framing or approach that we'll find pretty unique to permaculture, is this saying we need more perennial food crops, right? It seems almost esoteric to permaculture, this conversation about perennial food crops that can be provided by woodies, by trees, and by shrubs. Why Mollison was so keen on that is because of the work of J. Russell Smith and many people before him who did the research to show that in times of drought, in times of severe weather, chestnut trees continue to yield chestnuts and are superior as a foundation for civilization's staple crops to wheat, barley, rye, and all the conventional annual cereals that we're more familiar with. And what they were showing was that many cultures around the world, in particular in France and in Corsica and in Spain, have adapted to these tree crop sources of cereal grains for carbohydrates because they have seen time periods of severe deforestation, desertification, and drought. So tree crops, perennial crops, are an important balancing element of not putting all your eggs in one basket culturally for where your necessities are coming from. And so that's part of where permaculture particularly excels, is that it's got this very developed lexicon of saying, let's really think at a more historic level and at a geographic level about what it looks like to design a sustainable food system. What does that look like? And they're saying what it does not look like is large expanses of monocultures of cereal crops, right? So 1924, this is from J. Russell Smith's book. And here's where this page, I flipped this page and took a shot of this because I think it's a great snapshot of the permaculture real approach, is to say, let's look at other cultures. So here in this page, he's talking about Corsica and he's talking about China. And he's talking about how we can take examples of varieties that are already successful in Corsica and China and being used quite productively to provide a great alternative flour and other applications, but in particular for bread. We can take those species, those varieties, and we could start growing them in places that are like Corsica and like West China. And this is very unique thinking in permaculture, is this, we call this an ecological analog. And this is where you just start to creatively say, hey, look, I don't know everything about the genetics of this, but ballpark, these areas look really similar and it looks like these species could do well there. Why don't we bring some over here and start growing them here? At this point, the cat's out of the bag. We're in a global economy. All the pests and diseases, as we know, that can be transported are being transported. And so that's why this approach is something that, you know, plant botanists and historians have been doing this, you know, ever since human beings left the equator. We've been a major agent of plant migration and animal migration around the planet, right? So this is simply looking in particular at our capacity to do that with cultivated crops, with grafted crops, and to create educational sites that can transform mountainous and steep and rocky lands into places that aren't just clear cut for lumber, but also become productive, edible landscapes. And so Mollison, I think some of the important foundational concept here is he's saying, you know, transitioning from a consumer society to a society where more of us are producers is going to have a huge benefit that goes above and beyond when we've begun to burn out being activists who are resisting a system, and we haven't been doing a good job of putting some of our energy or most of our energy into actually creating an alternative to that system. And this is my sense of what Bill's getting when he says, hence the futility of revolutionaries who have no gardens, who depend on the very system they attack, and who produce words and bullets, not food and shelter. I think that's a helpful nudge from Uncle Bill, where he's saying becoming producers and beginning to supplant the present system sends a really strong message, in addition to refusing, resisting, and revolting against that system. Right? We need to do both. They're not mutually exclusive. The design principles are these different step-by-step methods. These are Holmgren's principles. Mollison words them a little bit differently. I tend to use Mollison's a little more when I'm applying design at a site design level. I tend to use Holmgren's a little more when I'm thinking about the broader application of them, more of a socio-political application. The few I'm going to track in on here, there's 12 on them. We're not going to cover all of them tonight. But as I mentioned, number 2 is, in my feeling, the foundational design principle, catch and store energy. Number 1 is, of course, very important, which is, you know, first, before coming up with any ideas, observe and interact with a place. And then the other I'm going to draw your attention to is number 7 is one that I find particularly useful, which is design from patterns to details. This I find to be an invaluable directive because it has many scales of application, right? Design from patterns to details is useful because it is encouraging us to avoid something that there's a real tendency to fall into in the Western mindset, which is to get really knuckled down on details before you've actually identified a pattern within which those details are now looking relevant, right? The Western mind is all about specialization and details, but what it's often not very good at is the broad picture, the context, right? And this is why permaculture is saying, first observe. Don't just rush in there and start doing stuff and think it's permaculture. Oh, we put in an herb spiral, there's a chicken tractor, no, that's not permaculture. Permaculture is a design process by which you observe the place and get a sense of what's really needed, and what's really suited, right? It's a design process. It can be applied to a city block, it can be applied to a park, and it can end you up with one of my favorite examples of a permaculture design in New York City is on 11th Street between Avenue A and First Avenue. And it is a zero stormwater discharge skateboard park that bioremediated a brownfield and has an educational greenhouse and compost facility on it, right? So there's no forest garden, there's no herb spiral. The whole focus of the design was zero stormwater discharge, bioremediation of a brownfield, and skateboarding. And then the gardening also happened to make some sense on the site as well. But be careful of this tendency to think, you know, permaculture is these outward aspects of it. It's really, for most practitioners and for the best applications of it, it's more of a design process that can be applied to any set of circumstances, right? So patterns to details is helpful because it is coming from that viewpoint of what does it look like to design a place in a manner that we can begin to see some broader interconnections and relationships within the elements that we place on the site. And then permaculture is things like this, these ways to create small earthworks, microcatchments. This is a side view of a small ditch on the uphill side that is dug to follow a contour line. And that's why it's called a swale, because that ditch that in this drawing on the uphill side, on the right-hand side, that has the word swale in it, that is going to catch water in a rain event. But then about 6 to 10 hours after the rain event ends, that's going to be dry. And the point of that ditch is to increase the absorption into the mound with the planting on it and to decrease runoff downhill. So what it does is it's water infiltration and it's soil saturation with the objective of decreasing the intensity of runoff on a slope. So swales are typically an earthwork that can be either, we've done them on sites. I'll show you some shots of some that we've done that are longer and bigger that we've done with transits and with surveying equipment. And then sometimes people do them with hand tools. Here's some vegetable beds that we did that are approximating, this is what's called a sun trap. And a sun trap in permaculture is when you have a curve, a kind of boomerang shape that is open in the middle to the sun, and the east and the west sides are where it's curving around. And this sun trap creates a shape that actually, it creates a kind of protected little area in the middle at the bottom of that shape. And permaculture is about really simple adjustments that can be substantial, like landscaping with fruit. This is one of my favorite books by a local orchardist and writer, Lee Reich, Landscaping with Fruit, really nicely laid out book. Very accessible to do these kinds of things as a way to help people begin to feel like there's more beauty and excitement in their lives by having things that they can eat brought into their landscapes. And that those things can be perennials and can be fruits and can last for years and years. And permaculture is also about addressing desertification on a broad scale. We'll see projects like Greening the Desert, Hope in a Changing Climate by John D. Liu, about the project that the World Bank does in the Loess Plateau. Those are broad scale applications of permaculture design. Desert or Paradise by Sepp Holzer on the right-hand side here. He's definitely one of the permaculture designers who is working at much larger broadacre applications. And it's also about things like the book here on the left I'm showing you is one of the best books out there on global examples of really innovative ecological water systems. What are ways that we can begin to really get creative about what we're doing with water? Some of what I'll be presenting here later comes from this book about biodigesters and lots of other materials. Creating Regenerative Cities, the one on the bottom that just gets a little, all your gang is the title of it. That book is written by Herbert Girardet. This is all being recorded, so I'll send you a copy of this after the presentation. Great book. Herbert Girardet, Creating Regenerative Cities, is showing what it looks like to apply permaculture design in the urban landscape. And again, it's a global survey. So he's going from Shanghai, he's going to Berlin, he's going over to Vancouver, he's going to Australia. He takes us all around the world to show us innovative things that are being done to improve urban landscapes with ecological restorative methods. Excellent book. Again, much of what I'll be sharing in here as we get towards the end of this comes from these two books, plus my own kind of putting them together with the regional application. I think it's important to recognize what permaculture brings us back to these foundational awareness is the trees are still the best solar collectors on the planet. They're harvesting solar income. They're providing us with fuel wood. They're providing us with nuts, providing us with fruit, providing livestock with grazing material. In many cases, these are very multifunctional landscapes, especially when we begin to think about planting particular varieties of nut trees, fuel wood trees, nitrogen fixing trees, and then grazing under them heritage breeds of, like you're seeing here, sheep, mainly for wool and for shearing. But then this same farm, this is a biodynamic farm in Pennsylvania, 425 acres. It's Camp Hill Village. In this orchard we're looking at, they first graze heritage breed dairy cattle through it. Then they graze the sheep through it. Then they graze chickens through it. And so an orchard that is managed like that as a pasture is going to be one of the most productive and wise ways to harvest sunlight that can be put together. Rather than thinking that we need photovoltaic panels, we actually need more functional ecological landscapes that are providing multiple benefits and multiple harvests. Much more than we need electricity, we need food. And when the way in which that food is being produced is also addressing energy issues, then we're taking care of several things simultaneously, right? So permaculture is like saying, all right, there's an existing farm field. What do we do with it if we want to apply some of these design methods and approaches to this site where the client is telling us they want to increase the amount of nut trees they have, and they want to have an annual vegetable farm that can create some value-added products, and they want to create a greenhouse system as well. So here's the design plan that we did for this same meadow, where we showed expanding the existing tree line with pecans, with English walnuts, with selected varieties of hickory nuts. So we've got pecans bookending it, and then walnuts and hickory nuts. And then a whole design for raised beds for a summer kitchen, for pollinator habitat, for movable greenhouses. And we came on the site and used the client's equipment and established these beds where we had drawn them into the design. And I like to show this one as an example for you of what I consider to be a good example of using tractors to establish a market scale production area that can then be maintained with hand tools and doesn't require the continued use of tractors. And this again is a kind of unique, kind of subtle approach that permaculture tends to specialize in, is what is the appropriate use of fossil fuel powered machinery to set up systems that don't then require the continued use of those fossil fuels or those machines to continue to give us a harvest, right? And what's that? And they over 600 million in unmet demand for local organic produce in the Hudson Valley. So already the demand outstrips supply, and that's a real issue in the Northeast and the organic food movement in general, meaning there's a lot of people who would like to buy organic food that was locally grown, but instead they're spending $600 million on organic products that aren't grown in the Hudson Valley. That's what it means when we have numbers like 600 million in unmet demand, right? And that's a number from the Glenwood Institute and from the Hudson Valley for Economic Development. So that's a number that I'm pulling from studies that are getting their data very succinctly and very geographic to this area. So this is a concept I'm going to kind of grow into here, is this really, when we look at how to leapfrog permaculture into a broad scale application. So what we're looking at here as far as these numbers, they're talking about, this is from a study that University of New Hampshire did where they studied what would it look like to grow all the food for all the people in 6 states in what they identify as lower New England, a 6-state region, 14.5 million people. And their estimate is to grow all the food for those 14.5 million people, and they do some data getting into what they call an omnivore's delight diet, not quite the amount of meat that the present American diet eats, which is probably a good idea, but not attempting to be entirely vegetarian. And so they're saying, look, if we create an omnivore's delight diet for 14.5 million people, how much land is it going to take to grow year-round full diet food supply for 14.5 million people in the states where they live? And their number is 16 million acres. So we're going to build on that, and we're going to look more at that. This is those same gardens, right? So crops that can be turned into kimchi, crops that can be turned into sauerkraut. We're also here looking at a perennial herbaceous plant, which is one of my favorites, which is lupin, right? So the lupin is a nitrogen fixer, and it's perennial, and it's herbaceous. A lot of the perennial plants in the Northeast in the temperate cold climate tend to be woodies. There aren't as many herbaceous nitrogen fixers or perennials. So according to Cornell, imagine this: diversified fruit and fresh vegetable farms make more money per acre than conventional farms do. Great. So here we've got, this is that same field that we installed, and now the beds are planted out. So these are these beds right here, and this is them all planted out. And you can see how this design, we put in a lot of, we've got blueberries, strawberries, cut flowers, asparagus beds, a lot of perennials. The other thing we focus a lot on install wise is rain tanks, really big rain tanks, not what I call token feel good 55-gallon barrel tanks, but 800, 1500, 3200. This is a 2700 gallon rain tank that we put in at a client's property. Here are on contour vegetable beds done as swales. So these are the longer ones that I was mentioning earlier that we shot with transit and surveying equipment. And, you know, I think there's ways to use people power and hand tools where it makes sense. And this type of system, while it may seem straightforward or mundane, it's actually important to point out is what we're doing here is we're using machines to establish beds, but then we're taking a pickup truck with compost and directly applying that compost with hand tools and teaching people, because a big part of these methods is about educating people. New York State is ranked number 3 in the nation for total number of acres dedicated to organic growing on certified organic farms. And when we look at the data of who gives more food to food banks, small local organic farms give more food to food banks than large monocrop farms do. So this also debunks this tendency that people will have to say, oh, well, organic food is an elitist foodie thing. No, actually, it's much more where the new food movement is going. It's much more where young farmers and beginner farmers are gravitating towards, and they are who support food banks and food security systems that already exist in our communities much more substantially than these farms that are growing monoculture cash crop soy and being subsidized, right? They are not supporting food banks. They are not where the new food movement is, and they have nothing to do with what resilience or regional food security looks like. And the finances around this stuff make also very clear sense, right? It's not like working in Silicon Valley, but it is definitely a lucrative job if people decide to focus on it. This is a farm where I take students to visit. This is a no-till certified organic tractor farm. So they use a tractor to move the compost around, but they never till their fields. They make their own compost on their site. They're NOFA certified. NOFA is the Northeast Organic Farming Association. They offer their own independent organic certification. So another thing to be careful of is this tendency to think, oh, organic doesn't mean anything because the USDA co-opted it. Well, no, that's not accurate at all. There are lots of great certification systems that predate USDA. USDA organic is still way better than nonsense like GMO free, right? Means nothing. USDA organic is still a better thing than nothing, no doubt about it. And when we want to get really discretionary as shoppers, it turns out there's OCIA, there's Oregon Till, there's all these other certifications that are much more legit than USDA. And any high quality organic product is usually triple certified. That's why they do that, because they know that buyers who are hip to these things are going to have that discretionary label reading habit. And they're going to go, wait a minute, is this more than just USDA organic? Right? So USDA is just the latest kid on the block. There were people who were doing that for decades before them, and a lot of them are still around. So NOFA, we've heard some, Matt, who's in here with us, has done some work with them, and they're really an important organization, great network, very inspirational. Every time I go to their conferences, constantly learning things and inspired by how many people continue to be excited to become farmers and growers, right? No doubt there is a burgeoning desire to get into being farmers. The challenge, we've created a permaculture land trust because we're also seeing that one of the big challenges in farming is access to land. So we're also getting involved in those projects. This is a really neat farm because they also have passive refrigeration. So it's a really dialed in design, right? It's only 4 acres of production. 2 acres makes about 160 to 200,000 a year just on heirloom tomatoes that he sells at farmers markets. And then the other 2 acres he rents out to people who want to run a CSA. And they get to use all of his equipment and learn the ropes of his systems. And then he switches where he's growing the tomatoes to be on where the CSA is every 2 years. And then the CSA is where the tomatoes used to be, so that he can avoid endemic pests building up on the crops he's propagating. The refrigeration is all done passively by an earth-burned root cellar. How about we take a break, folks? How's that sound? Yep. All right. Right on. Perfect spot for one. We'll take a 10-minute break. So I've got 7:23. We'll start back at 7:33 sharp. Thanks. All right. How are folks doing? Good. Any questions, comments, anything? Making sense?
I guess I was wondering about you mentioned the land trusts and how land availability is a problem.
Yep.
It's just something I've been thinking about lately in terms of like moving back to central New York and maybe getting a piece of land. And I did read a little bit about like things that people are doing with very small tracts of land, and even in the city here, like is that something you're going to touch on, like what you can do with little, like smaller amounts of land to make this kind of thing work?
We can certainly explore that. I will give some examples of it, but I could elaborate on anything you want to go further into too. Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah, just a curiosity, I guess, more than anything.
Yeah. Well, like I said, some of the one of the books that's really great on that is Landscaping with Fruit. That book that I showed, the Lee Reich book, definitely recommend that. Excellent source. Zach, any questions, thoughts, comments? No? Good. All right.
I'm still processing them.
Right on. I know one of my favorite things is to throw out a lot and then just see what you guys find interesting, and we can go further into various, areas that I'll navigate through. All right, well, I'm going to dive back in then, and feel free to interject too if folks have questions. I'll probably take us till about 8:30 or so. All right, where was I? We're right here, right? Yep. So this farm is called Four Winds Farm there in Gardner. No-till tractor, NOFA certified, earth berm, straw bale, passive refrigeration. That's the building that you're seeing in the background of the photo with the solar panels and the greenhouse. That's an earth berm, straw bale root cellar that they use for all their cold storage. So that's a big detail to understand, is that cold storage, when we think about regional food security, is a really important thing to have ideas about how to do passively without air conditioners, right? So this thing of getting deep underground, because you can see how that building, you see how grade, you see what slope is doing. That building is set into the hill. It's also traditional farming. It would be what's called a bank barn, right? A bank barn was when you built like a 2-story barn, but the first floor was actually underground from the uphill side where the second floor is. So again, this is another quick photo. This is here in Ellenville on our property, the Center for Bioregional Living. We have 14 acres here, and we have a 10-acre-old hay meadow where I rented this machine to do some ditching along a farm road, and then experiment with things like digging out spots that I had already identified with hand tools. And I dug a pilot hole to see, all right, this is really wet. And I bet if I come back here with the excavator, I could turn it into a pond. And that has enabled me to develop the confidence to then go on to clients' properties, rent a machine, dig a hole in the right spot, and be pretty sure it's going to pan out and be a pond, right? The neat thing about little micro ponds like this, pocket ponds as they're called, very ecologically restorative. All kinds of amphibians show up. It's a great example of what people in restoration ecology like to call build it and they will come, right? As soon as you create this kind of habitat, it's mind-boggling how much biodiversity shows up that was never there before, right? All kinds of critters that have no place to live now have a spot to live. And they seem to find it from other spots like this that are quite far afield, right? Plus, it's something that I can easily dip containers in for watering. I can easily set up a DC solar pump and use it to pump water for irrigation. Now it's a reservoir. So it's frog habitat, it's biodiversity, it's a watering hole for wildlife, and it's potentially a farm infrastructure resource, right? Firm believer that a really important node of the work we're doing and the work that needs to be done largely is education. So here I am in Brooklyn teaching permaculture design to all the awesome student base that we've attracted in Brooklyn, which is now thousands of students that have studied permaculture design with us in Brooklyn and in Manhattan. And it's apropos Bill's directive where he states the only ethical decision is to take responsibility for our own existence and that of our children. And to me, that involves getting to work, training people in becoming capable at creating a new food system and creating a whole different relationship with landscapes and with water and with how we're working with the land. And the practical skills. Here we are teaching a method that's in biodynamics that's called tree paste. And this is where you actually paint the tree in a combination of clay, cow manure, chamomile, equisetum tea, a bunch. It's basically like a homeopathic remedy for pests and fungus that's used in orchards. And teaching people, here's Adriana, my partner, teaching a biodynamic gardening class. Again, this is in Ellenville at Center for Bioregional Living. And I particularly like these raised bed systems because these can translate into suburban lots, into urban lots, and into country properties. I find having raised beds like this, no matter where you live, are a much more enjoyable way to garden, right? And accessible to a wider range of people than like, oh, you have to hop on a tractor to grow carrots. Now you can build a nice raised form and fill it with great soil. The first 10 inches of these beds is rotten logs. So these are sort of a combination of the uber popular hugel culture that's going around, right? The hugel culture method is largely associated with Sepp Holzer, the author of Desert or Paradise. And it's basically practical, right? Because in a 20-inch deep bed, I can fill 10 inches with rotten logs. Now I don't have to fill 20 inches with soil. I filled 10 inches with rotten logs, but it also performs benefits, right? It's like it's a sponge, cuts down on how much I need to irrigate, plus inoculates the soil with a mycelial community. So arguably a more diverse and rich soil community when you use rotten logs for the base. The compost is all made from, we ordered it from a company that is cooperatively run that's called Community Compost that uses all food scraps to make their compost. And we got about 9 yards dropped off on site, right? Teaching. This is Lisa DiPiano, good friend and colleague. Her and my friend David Harper were starting the Permaculture Living Lands Trust. This is Lisa teaching in Brooklyn in our classes there. Lisa is a professor at University of Massachusetts and teaches permaculture design certification at UMass. She's doing some really neat pilot projects there too, where they're doing silvopasture studies, rotationally grazing heritage sheep through a chestnut orchard that they've planted with Chinese chestnuts. And it's about the design process, right? Every student in our class does an individual design to graduate. And I modified that detail of the permaculture curriculum from being a group design assignment more than 17 years ago when I first began teaching PDCs, and never looked back. Having students do individual design presentations is part of why our course really teaches you design. You don't have to figure out how to work in a group with people who you might not work that great with. You instead learn how to do permaculture design. So there can be some, when I have longer classes at Yes Tomorrow, I teach a 12-day class that's an immersion class. There we do group design in the first week and we do final designs to graduate. In the online course and in the New York City course, it's a little bit more compressed. So if I have to sacrifice one, I sacrifice the group design and everybody does individual designs to graduate. There's one and only one solution, and we have almost no time to try it. We must turn all our resources to repairing the natural world and to train all our young people to help. They want to. We need to give them this last chance to create forests, soils, clean waters, clean energy, secure communities, stable regions, and to know how to do it from hands-on experience. Bill Mollison. And that's exactly what we're all about, right? This is why my focus has both been in having a really robust, high-powered permaculture educational program with great teachers and a great campus, and in creating great films and good videos and good educational materials that bring people into thinking about this who are entrepreneurs and creatives and can actually get the concept. Because many people, I think, misconstrue that the work in permaculture is to convince the world that it works. I would suggest the work is to actually share the vision, because the vision of permaculture is still not that well known and has very substantial potential star power that is vastly undertapped, right? And so my focus in teaching at New York City has been messaging a broader, more expansive, more planetary vision that then includes urban landscapes, high density environments with what it looks like to land the plane of permaculture design at a broader regional scale for master planning. Because see, that can inspire people in New York City who study with us to think about starting businesses, starting enterprises, becoming advisors for municipalities about how to address large-scale stormwater issues, infrastructure issues with permaculture design, right? And teaching people about even details like here we've got graduates working on solar thermal hot water panels because I found that solar thermal, vastly under-championed, more ecological than photovoltaic, doesn't involve rare minerals, is just made out of glass and copper, and gives you domestic hot water in a way that's very reliable and can be easily grid independent. And we teach people these methods. How do you make solar thermal panels? We teach people about planting nut trees, what varieties of nut trees, who are suppliers of them. So here we are with students planting out a diversity of nuts contributed to us by John Paul here, who runs his own nursery that's called Mandala Gardens in Staten Island. And we find vestigial plantings of unique, curated, grafted nut trees, some of them 70 and 100 years old. This is at a Quaker meeting house that I went to as a kid growing up in Pennsylvania. The tree behind me in the photograph is a grafted bur oak. The oak acorn I'm holding in my hand is from that grafted bur oak, which is a developed variety that has a much bigger acorn and much lower tannins and is developed particularly for pig farming, for forage, right? Here we are again, looking at vestigial plantings of grafted chestnuts that are in a suburban backyard outside the Philadelphia area where the landowner basically has no idea what's on their property. We identified it and discovered that this is an abandoned 80-year-old nursery that's there. And we're taking cuttings from it and working with other people in the permaculture community who are running nurseries, propagating these varieties and then distributing them through their nurseries. With trees, in addition, buildings. Big thing that I have strengths in and teach about is natural building. This is the first house we built for a client in New York State. This is in Coshecton. It's in the Delaware drainage. It's in Sullivan County. Every single stick of wood in this house came from on site. It's passive solar, solar thermal hot water through PEX tubing into the radiant floor. We teach all of our students these home construction methods, advanced ecological systems like solar thermal. This is Jeff, a graduate who's also a contractor, who's now built 4 houses for clients that we've worked with, 3 of them straw bale. The 4th right now is hempcrete. We're building the first entire hempcrete house from foundation to top in the Hudson Valley. All the ones before us so far that have been done are only renovations. Straw bale is the thing that I cut my teeth on, and that we built the first 3 houses and have found it to be a beautiful, fun material to work with. Part of our reason for working with it is it enables you to build a non-load bearing straw bale house where you eliminate Tyvek, Typar, and drywall. No plywood, right? So no plywood, no drywall, no house wrap. All permitted, all engineered, all approved by building department, right? Didn't take 5 years to build, took 1 year. Longer than most contractors want to spend on a house, but a reasonable amount of time to spend on a house of this quality. You know, we could never build this house again for what we built it at that time. It was 8 years ago. That house when we built it for $340,000. It came out to about $220 a square foot, turnkey construction. Now we're not building for less than $350 to $400 a square foot for turnkey construction, right? If you look at what passive house, if you look at what architects are charging right now, it's $450 a square foot for new construction, right? So when you look at this house, this is a century house that's built like a timber framed cathedral, and it's going to last way longer than these flim flam $425 a square foot passive house that's built out of chipboard and zip system and stick framing, right? Bunch of nonsense that people are charging top dollar for. It has a HEPA filter, it has a geothermal heat pump, it's got HVAC. Yeah, who cares? Because when the grid is out, you're screwed in those houses, right? This house, the grid is out, it's central heated with a wood stove with solar thermal going in to the slab. All the essentials in this place keep running whether electric is on or electric is off. And that's what security looks like in home design in a cold climate, right? You don't want to be held hostage to the grid in the winter here. This is the first house I built. This is in Pocahontas County, West Virginia. This is non-load bearing straw bale. It's a wood house. The straw bale is used for insulation. The main reason we use the straw bale is because you can use earthen plaster on the inside, earthen plaster on the outside, and the elimination of plywood and of drywall, right? And it's about broader acre design. So this is a redesign we did for a dairy farm in Fort Plains, New York, the Catskills area. And it's a nice example. I like to show this one because it's a 57-acre property, and it's a great example for you of how permaculture approaches landscapes in a way that is much more creative, diverse, and still making sense for what works on that property, right? So what we've done here is we've suggested things like vegetable production. You can see those are at the highest, driest, flattest areas that have the deepest soils. As soon as the property starts to slope, we're saying tree crops, silvopasture, which is where you combine strips of trees with grazing. It's a good technique for dealing with steeper slopes, but that you still want to have some sort of farming activity, grazing activity happening on. You can also probably see that at the top of the image, we design a lot of farm housing for labor into our designs because we find that many people don't think about who's going to do the work that you're designing into this landscape and where are they going to live, right? And another thing that I love building are 3-season off-grid camps where it's like gravity fed from rain tanks. It's a summer kitchen. We build a nice outhouse. We build a nice outdoor shower with a wood-fired hot water heater. And now people can cook. They can take a shower. They can have a cabin. They have places to stay. It's an important part of thinking about design suggestions for properties is to design into the design the human component of it. Who's going to be doing the work? Often when I'm doing designs for schools, like we did one for Yestermorrow, where I mentioned I've taught permaculture design courses for going on 17 years now. The longest running PDC I've taught is at Yestermorrow. We did a master plan for Yestermorrow. We did a design for them. And in it, I created a new position for their staff, which was a kitchen garden position. Because you need to think about if the goal of an institution, often that they're going to ask a permaculture designer to think about, is growing food on site for the institution, right? Could you grow something for our lunch program? Like, sure. But then you have to realize you're not going to be there doing the harvest, and nobody who works in the kitchen wants to come out and do the harvest, and they don't even have any garden or a garden yet on site. So like, great. So we got to establish a garden and figure out who is going to be the liaison between the garden and the kitchen. And that is why I created the position kitchen garden intern, right? So now you have an intern who's brought on, who is in charge of that relationship between what is coming in the garden. They know how to harvest, they know how to prep, and they know how to just set it up so the kitchen staff can now use what is in right now in what they're making in the kitchen, right? It's a key part that's often under thought out. And we're zooming into a detail of this. I'm spending time on this design because it's got a bunch of things that I think are strong aspects to understand about how permaculture approaches landscapes, because part of why permaculture is such a useful tool for retrofitting these often battered, damaged farms that have been abandoned that were a single function farm, right? The thing to remember about this is that these are farms that all they were trying to do was graze as many dairy cows as possible. And that's it, right? And as a permaculture thinker, you're going to approach a property with saying, well, what does the client want? What do they tell you their goals are? And then you're going to walk the property and say, all right, given that your goals are some agricultural activities, some grazing, some food, some nut trees, and you'd like to have some recreational use, we're going to show you how all those different things are going to happen on this parcel that used to do nothing but try to graze as many dairy cows as possible, right? And that's an important thing to understand the difference in the mindset between permaculture and much of the last centuries approach of farming in the northeastern United States and throughout the continental United States, which has been an approach to farming that has been about homogenization, centralization, industrialization, and single function farms, right? Single function farm is a broken model of farming. No farm that is ecological is going to only produce one thing, right? And permaculture is going to say, well, what are all the different things that could happen in this cool old hay meadow? Could we grow some swamp white oaks? The reason we're suggesting swamp white oaks there is really wet. And so we're like, well, what is a tree that likes wet feet, but could still have some sort of harvest that, say, if this owner was really keen on the idea of as much agricultural use as possible. So some sites we would design something that was more like a native ecology. But this site, we designed everything to have some kind of farm function as well as ecological function. And again, this combining of those worlds is one of the unique kind of agendas that we're focusing on with the Permaculture Living Land Trust, which is this idea, simple idea, but surprisingly uncharted by many of the well-funded state initiatives and conservation group initiatives at reforestation, at restoration ecology, right? Those initiatives, reforestation, conservation, restoration ecology, don't plant any species that have anything to do with people getting a harvest, right? Not even on their radar. You know, if we're going to plant 1,000 trees in a reforestation project along a stream bank, maybe you could plant 100 of them that are selected varieties of chestnuts, selected varieties of hickories, selected varieties of hazelnuts, right? Doesn't even dawn on them that maybe that might be a good idea, right? It's like so elusively simple that you think, oh, surely they would be open to that idea. Well, maybe. We are finding that some municipalities approached from the right perspective are definitely open to the idea. The state agencies may warm up to it eventually. Because in New York State, we've got well-funded reforestation through the DEP. It's called the Trees for Tributaries program. I'm sorry, through DEC, Department of Environmental Conservation. They do a program called Trees for Tribs, which means trees for tributaries, right? But what I'm suggesting here would be sacrilege to a lot of people in the conservation community. They'd be like, what? You're actually suggesting that we could graze grass-fed beef in a reforestation project, right? It's like outlandish. And that's bizarre that these worlds are so kind of like siloed, right? We've got the conservation community, and we've got the organic farming community, and we've got the carbon farming community, right? And we've got the regenerative agroforestry community. But it's like, well, how about if we all just like, could we all just like talk shop and share notes and like get some shit done? Hey, this tendency of people to act almost proprietary about their mailing lists and their knowledge set. And it's like, well, how about if we just try to create abundant landscapes that could feed future generations as they have a nice canoe trip down a stream and are having like edible nuts falling into their canoe and suddenly have like amazing fish that can be harvested because the whole riparian zone is reforested, right? So riparian buffer reforestation is a focus area because all kinds of groups agree it needs to happen. Tons of groups are like, we need to plant trees along streams, right? And so permaculture, you can kind of nudge your way into those conversations and say, how about if we expand the plant palette? How about if we diversify and widen the buffer and have all kinds of other things happening? Instead of 150 feet, we make it 500 feet. In the last like 300 feet, it's a coppicing wood lot with some rotational grazing. Here again, these are grafted hickory trees along a roadside in Pennsylvania. This is genetic value that is undervalued to not valued at all by a society that could care less about stuff like what? Who cares about a hybrid hickory tree that's been grafted along some road in Gettysburg, right? But to a permaculture mindset, we're looking at this and we're like, somebody developed some really valuable genetics here. The nut is really easy to crack. It's really tasty. it starts yielding in 6 years instead of in 15, right? These are valuable assets to food security. Silvopasture is a term I've used a couple times, and I wanted to share with you that in fact, even Cornell is on board with this being a really important idea for how to increase productivity, increase multiple harvests from various rural acreage, right? There's more grafted nut trees in an old, this is an old nursery that is now in a development, right? So regional planning, as we start to think about these different systems that I've been presenting to you that are key aspects of permaculture, these farming systems, using fossil fuels to set up farms that don't require as much fossil fuels, using trees, integrating restoration ecology work with cultivated ecologies, right? And as we scale this up and start to say, well, what does it look like to create a food system, an energy system, and building systems? Because I've introduced all three of those. What does it look like to implement them in a way that makes adaptive strategic sense, right? So this is the key formula that I'm suggesting is sort of like a synthesis of a number of these different concepts as we scale them up, right? What does it look like to scale up permaculture to a regional level? It involves this phrase that I use, which is we need to retrofit the industrial infrastructure to be more natural and more regionally self-reliant for energy and food needs. Right? And that's a crafted phrase that I'm using that has a bunch of very specific terms that I've put together. We need to retrofit, right? So I want to be clear that my thinking on this, that we want to take to the mainstream society, it's not about changing everything and starting from scratch. It's about retrofitting. It's also about transitioning from industrialization to something that's more natural. And it's not doing it in a way where we're trying to be 100% self-reliant. We just want to be more regionally self-reliant. And I also think it's important to define the terms. We want to be more regionally self-reliant in what? And I want to be specific, food and energy, right? And we're going to look to places like Copenhagen, like Stockholm, green belts, where cities began to say, let's create tax incentivized green corridors of growth around high density urban epicenters. A lot of big words and big concepts for Americans, but important things to be looking over the pond and asking, have things already been done that we should simply borrow and fast track here? And that's what I'm pointing to here. I'm saying we can get some quick results because we don't have to reinvent the wheel on this. And let's just comp on some stuff that we know is really smart that's already happening in places like Copenhagen, Stockholm, and Berlin, right? And others. Those are just to name a few. Let's think at a broad scale, watershed scale. Let's think about water systems and how to secure the water quality of those water systems. Let's understand why I'm saying retrofit, right? In the industrial food system right now, 1/3 of all the food in the United States is wasted. Many systems of analysis, like you're seeing here, this is a map by Scenic Hudson. Scenic Hudson basically dubs most of Ulster County, because tan is considered unproductive agriculturally. They basically consider most of Ulster County to be not important for agricultural purposes. The only part that they are focused on as a conservation group, I'm not suggesting that they should be trying to do more, but what I am suggesting is you're going to come across this thinking in Western agricultural sciences quite a bit, which is the notion that the only place you can grow food and do food crops is on prime agricultural soils. Now, I do agree with them that those are sacred soils that should be reserved for food crops. However, I don't agree with the presupposition that only prime agricultural soils are capable of producing food crops. That is an erroneous presupposition. We can grow food on steep, rocky mountain soils, all kinds of food, and to cancel them out in your thinking about what the potential food value is of the Hudson Valley is to miss a vast amount of where that production is going to come from. So again, this scaled up thinking is unique to how I like to apply permaculture design, and I think it'll help you in an intro course like this to get a sense of how these ideas can be applied to home scale gardening, but they can also be applied, arguably more importantly, to solving large scale climate instability, infrastructure instability, and supply line instability. And what I choose to focus on first is food, because as I've thought this through with the recent issues that have happened around renewables, around climate initiatives, I've started to understand that it is important to say food first, energy second. A little less than 2 acres per person to grow all the food for each person, a full rich diet within their watershed. So what I did here was we took the numbers, we said, how many people live between the southern end of this watershed that you're seeing and the northern end of the watershed? Those towns just happen to be, for reference, Wurtsboro and Kingston. And we did the data and said, how many people live in the whole land area between Wurtsboro and Kingston? Well, it's 91,500 people. And when we computed how much land area is in the Rondout watershed, which is the image you're seeing the sub watersheds colored in here, it's 719,000 acres. So if we use this formula, 2 acres per person, 91,500 people, it's basically going to take 118,000 of almost 720,000 acres of land. Very reasonable goal. Full diet, year-round food supply. And start to do, here's GIS mapping that we're doing of the same watershed, so that we can begin to get surgical about where does what go. What food crops, what tree crops, what energy crops make sense to be placing where. And we can take existing comprehensive plans and show how our ideas dovetail with them. We can start to take this bird's eye view of broader landscape areas. This one is particularly useful. This came out of Vermont post Irene, and I pulled this image because I find it to be a really helpful way to get across what does it look like to apply permaculture design at a broader landscape scale. So we're seeing, for instance, wherever there's upland and steep forested slopes, you want to keep them forested because they slow it, they spread it, and they sink it. What is that referring to? What do we want to do with water in the landscape? When rain lands on a geographic region, we want to slow it down. We want to spread it out, and we want to sink it into the ground. We want to move development out of river corridors, right? Conserve and avoid development. We want to identify geographically where are the safer areas and encourage development and growth there, which is why it's important to recognize that permaculture design is not about growth or not growth. Ecological design isn't just about growth for growth's sake. It's about asking, what are we trying to grow and where do we want to grow it? And identifying where are there vulnerable settlements. We want to protect people and buildings and facilities that we can tell are right in the gunshot lens of where a major flood event is going to happen. If we can't get them out of there, we want to have early warning and strategies for how to respond to severe weather events. We want to think about streams, since we're going to be staying away from them with development. And since, fortunately, in many cases, they haven't been built right up on top of, they provide this opportunity for what this image shows, which is a great diversity of eco-function and social function, right? And create a potential corridor for city to country connections, for places for bicycle paths, walking paths, wildlife corridors, performs a bunch of benefits as far as improving water quality because of shading and cooling, as well as essential food sources for macroinvertebrates that come from the leaves of trees that are along a stream. As they drop those leaves into the trees, caddisfly and other essential parts of the food web for brook trout are feeding on the leaves of the American beech tree. But if there's no American beech along the stream, there's not going to be macroinvertebrates in it that then support the other higher life forms. So there's a bunch of relationships that add up to why we want to keep streams forested, and why they then create an opportunity for social connection and for geographic connections. And to plant along them these unique grafted varieties of chestnuts and hickory nuts, so that as people walk along the stream, they can harvest some nice nuts to eat to supplement their diets, potentially to become an alternative to staple crops. Rooftops in the city can be used very effectively for leaf crops, for lettuce crops, bringing plants inside to clean up polluted indoor air. Bringing plants into the city, greening up the city is critical to improving urban environments, improving air quality, improving water quality, improving human experience of the landscape, right? It softens it. It makes the landscape feel much more human and people friendly. As we transition to energy now, the sun is the biggest thing going on planet Earth. Biggest energy source, biggest force affecting life on Earth. It's what we want to look to first when we understand the Earth system, is how does the sun work and what are potential relationships that we're not paying attention to that innately exist between the planet and the sun, right? So solar thermal hot water, I mentioned earlier. This is a technology that in China employs 600,000 people, provides all the domestic hot water for over a third of all the homes in China. Astonishing when you realize that their focus on this totally passive, doesn't use, totally different from photovoltaic, an entirely separate system that uses glass tubes. It's glass. All it requires is the ability to make glass. No rare minerals, no mining. And these evacuated glass tubes are so efficient, so well engineered, that they provide all the domestic hot water as well as radiant floor heating for apartment units as well as individual home units. When it comes to food, Shanghai has 15 million people, and these numbers are something for this country to aspire to, right? 15% of the people in Shanghai work in farming. They grow 4,000 tons of vegetables a day and provide over 60% of the city's vegetable needs. That's a city of 15 million people, right? So this stuff scales up quite seamlessly. In New York City, coming back to the States here, here's how we start to move in that direction. We're looking at getting this beautifully rich organic matter out of the trash. 3,380 tons a day of food scraps and organic material ends up in landfills, trucked out of New York City every day. 3,380 tons, right? Need many different locations, many different ways to handle compost in high density urban areas. I like these. They're simple, they're sealed, they're rat proof. They're so it can be full diet. In other words, you can put meat and dairy in there. Nothing's going to get to it. They're using a method that's called bokashi, Korean anaerobic ferment that uses an inoculant. And so it's actually a sweet decomposition that's happening without needing any carbon. Uses an inoculant of effective microorganisms, bokashi. Great for urban environments especially. It's important that we recognize, to me, that people aren't the problem. People being people is what we want to encourage. We don't want to send a message in permaculture and environmentalism, in ethical thinking, that suddenly people need to wear a hair shirt and be in some way self-flagellating in order to live an ethical life. It actually has a lot to do with the systems that we're nested in that are so amoral and unethical. And it is my confident belief that as we create different systems, we avoid this pitfall of thinking what we need to do is philosophically, morally elevate human beings to suddenly care about whether it's a number 5 or a number 6 and whether they turned a light on or turned it off. The reality is we want to make it so that if they throw something away, it just turns into compost. If you flip on a light, it's actually helping to create fertilizer. And so as people go to the bathroom, and in places like Burlington, Vermont, where we've got 42,000 people living completely grid independent, because Burlington, Vermont creates all their own electricity with windmills, with photovoltaic, with a power to steam plant, and with hydroelectric. And their whole grid, if the grid goes down in the Northeast, continues to run independently. 42,000 people. More engineers from municipalities need to study what's going on in Burlington and begin to apply some of what they've innovated there to other municipalities. I've looked at the numbers for comparables. Kingston's only 28,000 people. Burlington's 42,000 people. It's further north. They're already doing some things that we need to fast track in places like Kingston, places like Poughkeepsie, throughout the Northeast. We've got cities of this size. In Sweden, biogas, 25% cheaper at the pump than gasoline. I'm looking forward to the day we have buses with this stencil on them. This is what biogas is. Biogas is basically taking food scraps and organic material. It can also be used to treat sewage. And as it harvests the methane from the decomposition of food scraps, farm waste, black water, it harvests the methane, then it uses that methane for cooking, for hot water, and for generators. You can then polish the water coming out of a biodigester with a living machine. And these are an ecological wastewater treatment facility that uses the microbes at the root zone of the plants that you're seeing here. Here we're looking at one that is on the interstate as you are approaching the border of Vermont and New Hampshire, outside of Montpelier, Vermont. Where are we going to place all this green infrastructure as we retrofit New York City to produce some of its own power, to have biogas facilities, to have compost facilities? Well, as I've thought about the location, I discovered that there are 4,000 acres on 6,000 parcels of brownfields in New York City. And these are a perfect location for siting our new green infrastructure elements as we retrofit places like the 5 boroughs. In China, 30,000 biogas plants power 40 million homes. This is a technology that, just like solar thermal, you probably barely, if ever, heard of it. And it has these incredible manifold important benefits because it can enable us to take those 3,380 tons of food scraps, turn them into energy, and turn them into fertilizer, right? After generating electricity, after making hot water, the solids that come out of the anaerobic digester are excellent fertilizer. How much are we talking about needing to divert from landfills? 41 million tons annually. Right now, there are only 150 facilities in the entire country, according to the EPA, that commercially process compost, 150 in the whole country. Of them, only 40 process more than 1,000 tons a year, right? How much do we need to divert? 41 million tons a year. Here we're looking at one of my favorite operations to get inspiration from. This is Vermont Compost, where Carl Hammer, great teacher and mentor of mine, this is Carl in the foreground, using his smellometer to determine when exactly is this pile done. In addition, what Carl's doing is running a multi-million-dollar business making compost. But then as a side thing, he has 1,200 free-range chickens that lay 900 dozen eggs a month that he feeds nothing to. All they eat are the food scraps that are dropped off for him to make compost out of. So here they are eating the food scraps. That's all they get, no grain. And they happily lay 900 dozen eggs a month. And that is not what his business is. His business is compost, multi-million-dollar business with 10 full-time employees and a nation-renowned product. Greenhouse operators all over the country rely on Carl's soil formulas because they're so reliable and so trustworthy as far as not having outbreaks of fungus and mold issues in greenhouse operations. We're going to create jobs that don't suck and kill you prematurely of cancer. And that is why they're superior to all the jobs of the industrial, fossil fuel, oil, coal, and nuclear industries, right? Plus, we're going to double the amount of those jobs. So they're going to be healthy, non-toxic, beneficial, and that is an inherently superior way to grow our economy than continuing to dig ourselves a premature grave. So as we retrofit the industrial infrastructure, we're going to create an ecopolis. This is from Herbert Gerardet's Regenerative Cities. It's another term that's akin to the permaculture pattern recognition. What Geradet phrases it, he calls modern day urban systems a petropolis. He's saying they could not exist without vast quantities of petrochemical inputs. And he's suggesting here, he's saying we need to transition the petropolis of modernity to an ecopolis, where the city has a mutually beneficial relationship with the surrounding landscape that is ecologically restorative, not ecologically destructive. And it's about these city to country connections are what I feel this introduction, what I want to share with you about what can permaculture bring to a broader community. It's to make these connections. Permaculture is about connections, and the connections that we can make either intimately and interpersonally in our own homes and families and backyards, or also at a broader community and public scale when we think about regional and geographic patterns of relationships of what we'd like to see. And by advocating for these broader landscape mosaics, we begin to create a vision that can include a much wider sector of where our community is wanting to go and wondering about. And as people are riding their bikes along the bike trail, going from a city interior to a country exterior to go work on an agro-ecotourism farm, they can be harvesting heart nut and bort nut from this grafted tree that's adjacent to the bike trail. This is a tri-grafted bort nut, which is a combination of butternut and heart nut. Again, could be cut down tomorrow by a landscaping crew. We discovered it in a parking lot in Pennsylvania as a vestige of a nursery that was there more than 70 years ago. And there's the graft, right? You can see behind me on the trunk of the tree. That's where the tree was grafted, where that line is. And then you can see in my palm, the heart nut, why it's called the heart nut. Very tasty Japanese version of the walnut. As we scale these ideas up beyond the Northeast, these are patterns that exist throughout the entire world. Here we're looking at the North American continent. These are places that share similar soil, similar hydrology, similar geology, similar wild animal and plant communities. And they started out being called physiographic provinces. Now they're called ecoregions. Here we're zooming in on the Northeast. At a national scale, these define for us what crops make sense in the Great Plains, what energy systems make sense in the Great Plains is different than what crops make sense for the Appalachian Plateau, which is different then what energy systems make sense for the Atlantic coast, right? So each physiographic province gives us a set of parameters that we can start to say, all right, each region is going to have unique crops, unique buildings, unique energy systems that are designed and engineered to be well adapted to each geographic area of the country. So this is what I mean about how do we take permaculture design and begin to take it out of the backyard and into the broader landscape to address the greater social, economic, and environmental ills that we're all plagued with, rather than simply thinking we can use permaculture to create our own little ecotopic escape pod and somehow not continue to work on championing a broader vision that solves the broad scale problem. And it's about including our whole community, right? So here we're looking at the Rondout watershed. Let's start to have place-based senses of identity rather than defining place on a town name or on a city name, beginning to define place on geographic patterns like watershed, right? So this is the Rondout watershed. We're in the Rondout watershed. And this is about creating a diversity of green jobs, increasing self-reliance on a regional scale, honoring and remembering our ancestors, where we've come from, where we'd like to go. Witnessing and experiencing the awe of the planet, learning from the planet, being students of the planet, and recognizing that we're part of Earth and Earth is part of us, and really owning the power that we have as the prime mover and shaper of the planet. And rise to that planetary perspective to appreciate the true scale of our inheritance, realize water is a sacred gift that we always want to be coming back to in our designs and thinking thoroughly about. And designing for this cosmic scale that we're nested within inherently by virtue of being on a planet in outer space circling a sun. All right, folks, that's what I've got for you. Questions, comments, thoughts, feedback? Thank you, Zach. Thank you, Megan. So folks, we've got a design course starting up on February 11th. That's going to go more in depth into a lot of the things that I just sort of scratched the surface of tonight, right? Lots of things I could cover in an introduction to permaculture course. I'm hoping you found that to be a good romp through the permaculture landscape for you. Those are some of my favorite concepts, examples, and thinkers that I shared with you, but there are a lot more. Also, I think important to mention that in the design course, I've got a great cadre of teachers who teach the course with me. We've got Ramis Kent, who teaches with Jeff Lawton and PRI and does a lot of international work. We've got Nat Topa joining us, who's a new teacher who does primarily work in Africa and Asia. We also have Adriana Magana, who's a herbalist, musician, as well as a very talented gardener and healer. We have Larry Santoyo, who is a lead designer and permaculture educator in Los Angeles, who teaches at Caltech. And we also have, we've got Paula Hewitt Amram, who works in New York City, designing public parks with permaculture. And we have David Harper, who's a professional in the land trust field and worked as a consultant for Agrarian Trust, as well as doing fundraising for land acquisition for immigrant groups. So we've got a real diversity of people to learn from in our online course. We have a series of hands-on courses coming up this spring here in Ellenville that are also up on our website now. Questions, comments, thoughts, feedback, anything, folks? Cool. Well, if you're interested in the course, we're offering a discount to people who registered for this. So keep it in mind. You can send me an email. You have my email. I sent it out with this link. So you could just write me an email and say, yeah, I'm interested in the discount. What are the details? And I'll give you the specifics on that. And send people our way who are interested in it if you think they might be a good fit or enjoy the course. Check out our permaculture land trust. We've been recently afforded 501c3 status. We're going to be continuing to do a lot of work with protecting nurseries. If you come across people who have properties that you think would want to work with a land trust that focuses on permaculture aspects, meaning we want to protect properties that have perennial crops, that have tree crops, that have some sort of value from a permaculture design perspective. Well, if you get a chance, check out the film Inhabit, and I'll send you all a link to a shorter film that's got a little bit of what I presented tonight as a synopsis. I'll also send out as a follow-up to tonight the cloud recording of this session for you. So you'll have this as a reference. Cool. All right. Any other questions, comments? Great. Well, I'm going to wrap up then. Thanks for coming in tonight.
Thanks, Andrew.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you all very much. Have a good rest of your evening.
You too.
Thanks.